Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this really comforting expectation of just, well, absolute precision.
Oh, yeah. Like 100% clarity.
Exactly. Like you fall, you break your arm, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the glowing screen, and the doctor just points at it.
Right. There's no philosophical debate about the nature of the bone. It's just broken.
Yes. The mechanism for fixing it is equally clear. You set the bone, you apply a cast, you endure the healing process. We really crave that kind of binary, visible categorization in like almost every aspect of our lives.
We want the mechanics of our problems to be undeniably clear. Because, clarity dictates the solution. If the engine is misfiring, you replace the spark plug. The underlying physics aren't really up for interpretation.
But the moment you step out of the realm of physical mechanics and into the world of sociology or cultural development or, modern institutional health, suddenly that x-ray machine just completely shatters.
Oh, absolutely. It fragments.
Right. We're currently looking at a diagnostic landscape of modern society that is incredibly murky. Everyone is looking at the same cultural organism, but diagnosing completely different diseases.
Yeah, but not everyone believes it's murky. Some people believe they possess the exact unyielding blueprint of precisely what is broken, who broke it, and the aggressive measures required to fix it.
Which brings us to today. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Right off the bat, before we get going, please remember to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss one of these analyses. Today, we are unpacking a truly explosive, highly charged new ebook titled Virtue in the Scrum, Finding Absolute Moral Clarity Through Intense Physical Contact and Group Struggle by Conrad Riker.
It is a heavy one.
It really is. And listen, if dissecting this kind of polarizing ideological architecture is what you're here for, if you want to read the raw source code yourself after we analyze it, I highly recommend checking out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook. You can also follow the author directly to read more of his ongoing work at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Because this text, it's a masterclass in provocation. Riker is not writing a nuanced, delicate sociological survey here. He is writing an explicit, unapologetic manifesto directed squarely at a men's rights, red-pilled manosphere audience.
Yeah, the mission for our analysis today is to completely deconstruct Riker's central thesis. And that thesis is just massive in scope.
Huge.
He argues that modern institutions, from the university to the corporate boardroom, all the way to the athletic field, have been systematically captured by feminists and Marxists.
Right. And he asserts that men must intimately understand the history and mechanics of these institutions before they were captured to reclaim their biological imperative.
Yes. And crucially, he argues that the only viable mechanism for this reclamation is intense, organized, physical struggle.
But before we start turning the gears of this book, I need to lay down a very firm boundary for you, the listener. The source material we are examining today is deeply political.
Very much so.
It is aggressively countercultural, and it operates on highly controversial biological and sociological assumptions.
Yeah.
We, as your hosts, are not taking any sides here. We're not endorsing Conrad Riker's viewpoints, nor are we utilizing this platform to, debunk them from a place of personal or institutional bias.
Exactly. Our sole job today is strictly to impartially report, analyze, and synthesize the arguments exactly as they're presented in the text.
We are holding up a mirror to a highly specific, rapidly growing ideological architecture so that you can understand the exact logic of how it's built.
We're mapping the territory, not telling you where to build your house. So let's jump straight into the foundation. Riker opens the book with his core diagnosis of where modern society veered off a cliff.
The starting point.
Right. This is the philosophical baseline that holds up every other argument in the subsequent chapters. He introduces a concept he terms the dimorphic anchor.
The dimorphic anchor. So he defines this as the strict, undeniable biological divergence of male and female. For Riker, this isn't just a scientific observation.
Yeah.
It's the heavy iron anchor of any stable, enduring civilization.
Right.
He posits that human societies are naturally chaotic, right? They're constantly threatened by internal decay and external threats.
Sure.
And he says the strict adherence to traditional, biologically divergent roles is what actually tethers the ship of state to reality.
And he claims that what he broadly categorizes as the female-coded left is actively wielding an axe, basically trying to sever this anchor rope.
Right, he outlines this attempt as a deliberate blurring of gender roles, a demand for physical and psychological homogenization.
Yeah, and an overarching cultural movement that treats the natural expressions of traditional male
Yeah.
biology, aggression, competition, stoicism, as a systemic poison that basically needs to be eradicated.
And to illustrate the severity of this shift,
Ah.
Riker bypasses modern sociological studies entirely and takes the reader straight to ancient Greece. He focuses intensely on the Spartan ego.
Which was the state-sponsored education and training program for all male Spartan citizens.
Right, but to call it a training program almost undersells Riker's framing.
Yeah.
I mean, he details how Spartan boys were removed from their mothers at age 7 and thrust into this brutal communal existence.
Okay.
The state fundamentally understood that its geographic and political survival depended entirely on forging these youths into hardened, unbreakable warriors.
Yeah.
The Agoj wasn't designed to make them well-rounded citizens. It was a crucible.
Right.
Weakness, hesitation, and emotional fragility were literally beaten out of them, and martial virtue was hammered into their psychological architecture through intense, uncompromising physical struggle.
And then, so you contrast that historical reality with Riker's view of modern institutions. I mean, he points a very harsh spotlight at the modern university system.
Oh, yeah.
He vividly labels it the anti-Agoj.
He views the modern campus as the exact inverse of the Spartan model. Instead of a crucible that hardens the individual through friction, he describes the university as an intellectual and emotional padded room.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker argues that within this padded room, natural masculine energy is not channeled, it's not honed, and it is certainly not utilized for the defense of the civilization.
Nope. Instead, it's immediately diagnosed as a psychiatric disorder, medicated into a state of docile compliance, and replaced with what he views as a vapid apologetic weakness.
He makes a very specific claim here. He says we have collectively traded the Spartan shield for the emotional support animal.
No, that's the exact quote.
And he does not view this as an accident of modern comfort or like a natural evolution of a peaceful society. Riker argues this is a deliberate, highly coordinated attempt to breed martial discipline out of the human species in order to make the population easier to manage.
It's a striking image.
It really is.
Yeah.
Let's try to visualize the mechanics of what Riker is describing. It sounds to me like an over-engineered engine governor.
Okay, how so?
Well, you have this high-performance engine representing raw masculine energy and capability that was originally built to operate at incredibly high RPMs to pull the heavy machinery of civilization forward.
Right.
But the modern institutional mechanics are terrified of the noise, the heat, and the potential danger of that engine. So they install this digital governor that aggressively cuts the fuel supply the second the engine revs above an idle.
They're turning down the heat.
Exactly. They aren't just slowing it down, they are fundamentally altering its capacity to do the work it was built for. But, that brings up a massive philosophical question.
It is.
How does Riker actually justify the premise that aggression, literal physical capacity for violence, is the absolute foundation of a functioning civilization?
Well, to answer that, Riker reaches deep into Enlightenment philosophy. He constructs his argument on the foundation laid by Thomas Hobbes,
Okay.
specifically in his 1651 masterpiece, Leviathan.
Oh, right. Hobbes was writing during the incredibly bloody English Civil War, right? So his view of humanity was forged in extreme chaos.
Precisely. Hobbes argued that the natural state of man, what he called the state of nature, is essentially a war of all against all.
Yep.
Left to our own devices, stripped of societal structure, human existence is nasty, brutish, and short. Riker adopts this completely. He argues that order, safety, and civilization are not our default evolutionary states. They are anomalies,
They have to be maintained?
violently carved out of the chaotic wilderness and aggressively maintained, yes.
So the capacity for aggression is just like the required baseline for entry into civilization. If you can't fight the chaos consumes you.
According to this framework, yes. But Riker doesn't stop at pure, unfiltered aggression. He brings in the philosophy of John Locke to transition from the raw state of nature into civil society.
How does he use Locke?
Well, Riker utilizes Locke to argue that regulated aggression is the true bedrock of order. Aggression that is consciously channeled through strict rules, rigid hierarchies, and unwavering codes of honor.
Ah, so this is the jump from the wild wolf to the domesticated sheepdog.
That is the exact psychological profile Riker is elevating. Riker's logic dictates that the man who is entirely capable of great, devastating violence, but who consciously and deliberately chooses peace through his own strict internal discipline, is the singular pillar holding up the roof of society.
He has the capacity to destroy, but the virtue to protect.
Exactly.
And in Riker's view, how does the modern pacifist fit into this Hobbesian reality?
He has absolute disdain for the modern pacifist. Really, I mean, he argues that a man who is physically incapable of violence is not actually peaceful, he is merely harmless.
Wow.
Yeah. Riker views this harmless man as a societal parasite, a biological free rider who reaps all the benefits of the safe perimeter established and defended by better, more capable, more aggressive men, while simultaneously lecturing those same men on the evils of their aggression.
So when modern university culture or corporate HR departments treat male testosterone, competition, and aggression as a toxin to be managed, Riker doesn't just see it as an annoying policy.
No, he views it as a civilization actively attacking and destroying its own immune system. He calls it societal suicide masquerading as moral progress.
Which naturally forces a geographic and sociological question. If the modern university is the anti-agos, and if the corporate boardroom is actively hostile to this Hobbesian reality, where does Riker suggest these men actually go?
Because they can't just evaporate.
Exactly. This leads us directly into his exploration of the sanctuary of exclusive male spaces. Riker makes this sweeping historical claim that the foundational bedrock of Western civilization was not forged in mixed company, highly moderated environments.
Right.
It was built in fiercely guarded, male-only sanctums.
And he points again to antiquity to prove this. He cites the Spartan Syssitia, the communal mandatory mess halls where warriors ate and bonded away from their families, and the Athenian gymnasia, where men trained, debated philosophy, and socialized entirely naked, stripped of social pretense.
To explain the required mechanics of these spaces, Riker introduces what he calls the syllogism of separate spheres. Walk us through the specific logic of that syllogism. How does he construct it?
It's a rigid three-part logical structure. Riker begins by defining the specific utility of a male space. He states that the purpose of these spaces is to forge men, to allow them to strategize openly, to build resilience through intense physical and verbal friction, and to hold each other to harsh, objective standards of competence.
The forge.
Yes, the forge. The second part of the syllogism is the mechanism of that utility. Riker argues that this specific utility relies entirely on the absolute psychological removal of the mating dynamic. He categorizes this dynamic as the female gaze.
So his argument is that when a woman enters the room, the neurobiology of the men in that room instantly alters.
Fundamentally alters.
Huh?
Riker argues that the moment the female gaze is introduced, men subconsciously pivot from a framework of objective peer competence to a framework of reproductive competition or social accommodation.
They change their behavior.
Right. They soften their critiques, they posture, they modify their language to avoid appearing threatening, or they compete for attention.
So the focus shifts from the internal objective of the group to the external perception of the observer.
Which brings us to the conclusion of the syllogism. Therefore, forced inclusion logically and inevitably destroys the space's utility.
I see.
If the utility requires the absence of the mating dynamic, and inclusion forcibly reintroduces the mating dynamic, the original utility of the space is entirely eradicated. It ceases to be a forge and becomes a stage.
And Riker is incredibly specific about the historical timeline of this destruction in the United States. He doesn't just speak in abstract philosophy, he points directly at Title IX, which was passed in 1972.
Yes.
Now, standard historical texts and the way it's taught in schools frame Title IX as landmark civil rights legislation. The stated goal was to create equal opportunity in federally funded education and sports, ensuring women had the same access to athletic development and scholarships as men. Riker completely rejects that historical narrative.
He frames Title IX as a calculated, institutional, gynocentric assault. Riker analyzes the actual legal application of Title IX, specifically focusing on the proportionality prong of the compliance test.
Which requires that the demographic breakdown of the athletic department matches the demographic breakdown of the student body.
Exactly. Riker argues that because men, historically and biologically, display a much higher aggregate demand for intensely competitive, physically dangerous sports, the proportionality requirement acts as a destructive quota.
Right.
He argues its actual material application was not just to build up women's sports, but to systematically defund, dismantle, and erase deeply established male-only athletic spaces like collegiate wrestling, gymnastics, and swimming programs, simply to manufacture an artificial, statistically perfect parity.
And to anchor his argument that this forced parity is fundamentally anti-scientific, he uses a highly specific, very controversial real-world example to prove what he calls the absolute biological reality.
The FC Dallas game.
Yes. He points to a specific historical instance where the FC Dallas under-15 Boys Academy soccer team played a scrimmage against the fully grown World Cup winning United States women's national team, and the teenage boys won.
Riker leverages that specific event as irrefutable, undeniable scientific proof of the biological chasm between the sexes. He's very careful to state that this is not an emotional slight against the female athletes who are the elite of their category.
No, he says it's just raw data.
Right. He uses it as raw data.
Yeah.
He argues it as confirmation of an unbridgeable evolutionary gap in fast-twitch muscle fiber, lung capacity, bone density, and spatial reasoning that no amount of progressive social engineering, legislation, or funding can ever overcome.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting because I have to jump in here and interrogate the structural logic of this argument.
Yeah.
Riker uses the FC Dallas example as scientific proof of an unbridgeable biological gap in athletic performance metrics. He says a 15-year-old male physiology outperforms an elite adult female physiology on a soccer pitch. But how does he link from athletic performance metrics like who can accelerate faster or strike a ball harder to the absolute sociological rejection of mixed gender spaces in intermediate institutional life?
That's a big jump.
It is. A corporate boardroom is not a soccer pitch. How does physical speed dictate the necessity of separate intellectual or social spheres?
That is the exact friction point of Riker's text, and he attempts to bridge that gap by bringing in the sociological concept of the third place. He leans on the work of urban sociologist Ray Oldenburg.
Oldenburg defined the third place as the vital social surroundings that are completely separate from the two primary spheres of the home, the first place, and the workplace, the second place.
Right. The local tavern, the coffee shop, the community center. But Riker narrows this definition drastically. For Riker, the only third places that matter for masculine survival are decentralized, physically demanding male brotherhoods.
Like what?
The rugby pitch, the underground boxing gym, the Brazilian jiu-jitsu mat. He argues that these spaces are the last remaining bulwarks against a total mental health catastrophe for modern men.
Because these spaces simulate the Hobbesian reality that the modern world has sanitized.
Exactly. They provide evolutionary pack dynamics under the intense stress of physical threat. Riker argues that the male brain evolved to find meaning, hierarchy, and peace specifically through the mechanism of shared physical struggle against a common obstacle.
Wow.
And to illustrate this leap from raw physical biology to complex sociology, he uses a very powerful historical touchstone, Easy Company, the famous 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment from World War II.
The men immortalized in the book and miniseries Band of Brothers.
Yes. Riker details the brutal training of those men at Camp Toko. Specifically, the legendary runs up Currahee Mountain in Georgia. 3 miles up, 3 miles down, in heavy boots, until they bled.
Yeah, intense stuff.
Riker argues that this intense shared physical suffering was not just about building cardiovascular endurance, it was a psychological forge. The mountain stripped away all ideological pretenses, all individual narcissism, all differences in class or background. What was left at the top of that mountain was raw, unfiltered, deeply bonded masculine loyalty and extreme competence.
He argues that the physical pain was the active ingredient. It wasn't a byproduct of the training. It was the mechanism of the bonding.
Absolutely. And his overarching sociological point is that without that physical threat, without the harsh, undeniable reality of the forge, the pack dissolves. When modern society neutralizes all physical threats and replaces them with luxury, safety, and the emotional demands of mixed company environments, Riker claims the brotherhood fragments. Men become atomized, cowardly, and vulnerable individuals who seek comfort over competence, making them easily controlled by the state and corporate structures.
So, zooming in from the broad macro concepts of institutional capture and historical military battalions, the text naturally zeroes in on the actual physical actions that take place within these remaining sanctuaries.
The micro level.
Right. If the BJJ mat and the rugby pitch are the last holdouts, what actually happens there? This brings us to his intense critique of the physics of contact sports and what he labels the cult of safety.
Riker attacks the modern safety apparatus governing contact sports with incredible ferocity.
He really does. He starts this argument by pointing to a specific piece of pop culture, a 2018 NFL Super Bowl commercial. This was a highly stylized ad that visually connected medieval knights in armor, Roman gladiators in the Colosseum, and Japanese samurai directly to modern American football players. The visual metaphor was undeniable.
Riker uses this commercial to say, look at what they are admitting. Deep down, at our core, we all know exactly what this sport is. It's not just a game of throwing a leather ball, it is an abstraction of warfare. It was the primal arena.
Yeah.
But he argues that the modern institutions running these sports are terrified of that reality. He views the ever-expanding rule book, specifically strict helmet-to-helmet rules,
Yeah.
the protection of the quarterback with roughing penalties, and the subjective implementation of targeting ejections not as scientific medical advancements to protect brain health.
Which is exactly how the NFL and the NCAA market those rules. They frame it entirely as player safety and longevity.
Riker entirely rejects that. He views these rules as an ideological propaganda war waged against the immutable, objective laws of Newtonian physics. He believes these regulations represent the institutional prioritization of maternal sentimentality over masculine reason and the reality of mass times acceleration.
To explain the psychology of how this safety culture consumed the institutions, he relies heavily on Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory.
This is a pivotal analytical tool for Riker's argument. Jonathan Haidt, a prominent social psychologist, demonstrated through extensive research that human morality is not a single concept, but relies on several distinct evolutionary pillars.
Let's list those out so we understand the framework. Haidt identified care harm, fairness cheating, loyalty betrayal, authority subversion, sanctity degradation, and liberty oppression.
Haidt argues that different political and cultural groups rely on different combinations of these pillars. Riker takes this framework and makes a very aggressive claim. He argues that the modern female-coded left operates almost entirely and exclusively on a single axis, the care harm foundation.
Which evolved from the mammalian instinct to protect vulnerable offspring.
Exactly. Riker claims that while this maternal instinct is absolutely vital and suited for the nursery, it is catastrophic when applied as the governing philosophy of a complex civilization.
Oh, wow.
By defining all harm, even voluntary, consensual, rule-based physical friction between grown men, as the ultimate, unforgivable moral sin. Riker argues that the left actively destroys the other masculine moral pillars.
They sacrifice loyalty, authority, and sanctity on the altar of care.
Precisely. Riker argues that when the safety-obsessed administrator looks at a bone-crushing rugby tackle, their care harm radar goes crazy. They see only brutality, trauma, and liability.
Right.
They are entirely blind to Riker's philosophical view that controlled violent physical combat is the highest possible form of mutual respect and the ultimate expression of the sanctity of the human will.
You know, it makes me think of an overactive autocorrect algorithm on your smartphone. Imagine you're trying to type out a very complex, raw, maybe slightly jagged and aggressive thought. You want the friction of those words. But the software is programmed to prioritize safety and politeness above all else. So the second you hit send, the algorithm forces your text into a smoothed out, corporate-friendly, completely harmless sentence.
That's a great analogy.
It successfully removes the friction, but it fundamentally alters the meaning and the impact of what you were trying to communicate. The original intent is destroyed by the safety mechanism. So what does this all mean for the athlete's internal psychology? How does Riker think this cult of safety actually affects a man's character on a neurobiological and philosophical level?
Well, to explain the internal degradation of the athlete, Riker breaks this down using Aristotelian virtue ethics, specifically pulling from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics.
Aristotle's manual on how to live a good life.
And Aristotle's core tenet regarding virtue is that it is not a passive state of being. You're not born virtuous, and you cannot memorize virtue from reading a textbook in a padded classroom. Virtue is a habit.
Right.
It is forged exclusively through repeated conscious action under varying degrees of pressure.
Aristotle called it habituation. You become a builder by building. You become a harpist by playing the harp.
And crucially for Riker, you become brave by doing brave acts in the face of actual danger. You do not become brave by thinking safe, pleasant thoughts. You become brave by confronting physical friction, enduring the fear, and overcoming it.
So it requires real stakes.
Absolutely. Therefore, Riker argues, when the institution removes the physical friction from the sport, when they legislate the danger out of the tackle, they are removing the required mechanical mechanism for building bravery.
They aren't just making the man safer, they're literally preventing him from becoming virtuous.
They are stunting his moral development. And Riker takes this a step further into the realm of psychology, utilizing Carl Jung's concept of the shadow.
Jung's idea that the human psyche contains hidden, often darker or unacknowledged aspects of ourselves that we refuse to accept, so we project them outward onto other people.
Yes. Psychological projection. Riker argues that the female-coded left and the male administrators who serve them fundamentally lack the biological capacity and the mental fortitude to embody physical stoicism and martial courage.
Okay.
They cannot endure the friction of the scrum. Because they cannot meet this standard, their ego protects itself through projection.
So they rebrand their own weakness as a moral virtue.
They label male stoicism, physical aggression, and unapologetic masculinity as toxic. But Riker insists they don't do this because masculinity is actually harmful to a functioning society. They do it to excuse their own mediocrity.
Wow.
It is an envious, destructive rage against a biological standard they know they can never achieve. So instead of trying to climb the mountain, they try to bulldoze the mountain so everyone is standing on the same flat, safe plane.
That is a wildly uncompromising psychological diagnosis. Okay, so we've exhaustively covered the physical autonomy of the man in the scrum and the psychological autonomy required to resist the institutional cult of safety. Having established those two pillars, the deep dive shifts into a completely different gear. We transition to how Riker believes the modern man must protect the tangible, material fruits of all this physical and psychological labor. We are talking about economics, we're talking about wealth.
This is a fascinating pivot in the text, from the metaphysical and the psychological to the intensely, ruthlessly practical. Riker asserts that all the physical hardness in the world is useless if a man remains an economic slave.
Makes sense within his framework.
He insists that men must aggressively reclaim the financial power of what he terms masculine capital.
He outlines an overarching economic theory that he calls the subsidization matrix. This is his view of modern economics applied to both collegiate sports and broader corporate society. He argues that the massive billion-dollar revenues generated by the bone-crushing, high-friction physical labor of young men in football and basketball are forcibly siphoned away by the institutional bureaucracy.
And where does he argue that capital goes?
He claims it's redirected to subsidize unprofitable, female-coded sports and administrative diversity programs that possess zero organic free market demand. He views this dynamic not as institutional fairness, but as a vast systemic wealth transfer that financially emasculates the producer to fund the parasite.
But Riker finds a profound moment of structural triumph in recent legal history to illustrate the way out of this matrix. He heavily celebrates the NCAA versus Alston Supreme Court decision from 2021.
Which was a unanimous 9-0 decision by the Supreme Court.
Yes, the Alston decision effectively shattered the NCAA's long-standing antitrust exemption regarding education-related compensation. It essentially stated that the NCAA could no longer legally cap the benefits athletes received, destroying the traditional defense of amateurism and paving the way for the current name, image, and likeness, or NIL era of college sports.
And Riker doesn't just read this as a dry legal ruling about antitrust law. He frames this as the ultimate ideological triumph of pure masculine capitalism over what he labels as socialist administrative dictation. The gladiator, finally, legally, gets the right to his own market value.
He points specifically to Bryce Young, the former Alabama quarterback. Bryce Young reportedly possessed a $1 million NIL valuation before he even took a single snap in his sophomore season.
That's incredible.
Riker writes about this with intense admiration. He sees that million-dollar valuation not as modern excess or the corruption of a pure game, but as the pure, unadulterated validation of the free market's unfiltered preference for elite male prowess. The market wants the gladiator, and the market is finally paying him.
Okay, let's unpack this carefully because the logic here is fascinating. The athlete finally gets his money. The gladiator is paid his true market value under the laws of supply and demand. But Riker's advice doesn't stop at just securing the bag. He doesn't want these men to get paid and then go buy depreciating assets like luxury sports cars or designer watches. He wants them to build a literal, impregnable fortress. How exactly does he instruct the reader to protect this newly acquired wealth from the very institutional system he absolutely despises?
Riker provides a very calm, incredibly specific step-by-step operational protocol for building what he calls an anti-fragile portfolio. He borrows the concept of anti-fragility from the essayist Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Taleb's concept being that something fragile breaks under stress. Something robust stays exactly the same under stress, but something anti-fragile actually gets stronger and benefits from chaos and volatility.
Exactly. But Riker applies Taleb's economic theory with the distinctly patriarchal combative logic. The first step in this protocol is absolute divestment from the modern institutional system.
Pull in the plug.
Yes. Riker advises men to immediately pivot their capital away from ESG-compliant paper assets and the broader fiat currency system.
ESG standing for environmental, social, and governance criteria. These are the metrics used by massive asset managers to evaluate a corporation's collective conscientiousness regarding social issues.
which Riker views as a cancerous artificial mechanism of leftist control. He argues ESG is a system designed to force independent corporations to bow to a feminist, collectivist hive mind, completely overriding traditional fiduciary duty. He wants male capital completely decoupled from that system.
So if they pull their money out of the standard stock market, where does he command them to put it?
He commands his readers to hoard physical, undeniable resources. He wants them buying commercial real estate, physical commodities like gold and oil, and investing in private equity where they control the board.
Hard assets.
Hard assets. Riker describes commercial real estate as patriarchy encoded in physical law. His logic is brutal in its simplicity. You own the dirt, you own the steel structure sitting on the dirt, and therefore you possess the absolute sovereign right to dictate the terms of existence within those borders.
Tangible, immovable assets that cannot be deleted by a cultural shift or a canceled bank account.
But owning the physical assets is only half the battle. The second half of his protocol is legal defense. Crucially, I want to detail Riker's deep reliance on Roman legal traditions. He instructs men to aggressively utilize trusts, limited liability companies, and, most importantly, prenuptial agreements.
We need to spend significant time on this because he has a highly specific, deeply controversial view on prenuptial agreements. It is certainly not the standard financial advisor's view of protecting your assets in case things don't work out.
Not at all. Riker frames the prenuptial agreement not as a cynical or unromantic financial document, but as the ultimate Roman legal fortress. He anticipates the cultural pushback. He argues that the modern female-coded matrix tells men that a prenup implies a lack of trust or romance, specifically because the matrix wants unfettered access to the man's resources.
He views the modern family court system, the apparatus of no-fault divorce, alimony, and asset splitting, as a deeply gynocentric mechanism designed specifically to strip the conquering male of his hard-earned estate.
Therefore, in Riker's architecture, the prenuptial agreement is not a marital contract. It is a military defense strategy. It is the legal moat guarding the sovereign borders of the patriarchal enterprise. It ensures that the man retains absolute authority over the capital he generated through his own friction and struggle.
It's all about total impenetrable sovereignty. Physical sovereignty on the field, psychological sovereignty against the culture, and economic sovereignty in the bank.
A complete fortress.
Which brings us to the final critical piece of Riker's puzzle. Once a man is physically hardened from the scrum, psychologically resilient against the cult of safety, and financially independent behind his Roman legal fortress, how must he interact with the rest of the world? How must he navigate the daily cultural battlefield of communication, HR departments, and public discourse?
Riker argues that the final step is mastering what he calls the language of the gods.
Riker goes completely on the offensive here against modern corporate HR culture. He brutally attacks the ubiquitous concept of work-life balance. He calls work-life balance a leash, an ideological pacifier designed explicitly to keep men compliant, comfortable, distracted, and ultimately depressed.
He really hates that phrase.
He does. He argues that true mastery, true human excellence, requires a state of permanent obsession.
He presents a formal, logical syllogism here as well to prove his point. His major premise. Mastery in any valuable field requires an obsession that consumes all waking hours and physical energy. Minor premise. Obsession is the exact antithesis of balance. It is inherently unbalanced.
Okay.
Conclusion. Therefore, the pursuit of work-life balance functions as an active, structural barrier to the achievement of human excellence.
And to illustrate this utter rejection of balance, Riker points to the legendary NFL wide receiver Jerry Rice. Specifically, he highlights Rice's infamous, brutal off-season hill sprints in California. Rice would run a 2.5-mile dirt trail with a punishing incline every single day, driving himself to the point of absolute physical collapse.
And Riker analyzes Rice's sprints through a highly unexpected, deeply philosophical lens, the ethics of Immanuel Kant.
That structural leap genuinely blew my mind when reading it. Jerry Rice's cardiovascular system analyzed through 18th century Prussian philosophy. Explain how Riker connects them.
It's wild, but Riker argues that Jerry Rice wasn't running that punishing hill just to secure a better financial contract or to win another Super Bowl ring or to get cheers from a crowd. Those are external utilitarian motivations.
Right, you're fleeting.
Riker analyzes the sprints through Kant's concept of duty. He argues Rice was fulfilling a Kantian duty to himself a categorical imperative of physical supremacy.
Meaning he did it because the act of dominating the physical realm is an end in itself.
Precisely. Rice bound himself to the universal law of athletic domination. He treated every grueling stride up that dirt hill as an exercise in supreme rational autonomy. He was imposing his will onto the physical universe.
Think about that. Contrast that Kantian duty, Riker says, with the modern, feminized professional athlete who demands load management and voluntarily sits out games to rest when they aren't even injured. Riker views load management as a cowardly, rationalized retreat from the friction required to forge a competent male.
And this demand for philosophical rigor extends far beyond the athletic field and into how men must actually speak and think in society. Riker launches a blistering attack on woke language policing.
Oh yeah, he goes hard here.
He claims that postmodern academics and the cultural left have deliberately and systematically severed language from objective material truth.
What the ancient Greeks called the logos, the fundamental order and truth of the universe.
Yes. Riker argues the left destroyed the logos in order to manipulate the masses through subjective emotion rather than objective fact.
He cites a massive cultural flashpoint from 2018 to anchor this argument. The Nike and Betsy Ross flag controversy.
Oh, that's right.
Nike was preparing to release a special edition shoe featuring the original 13-star colonial American flag. However, they pulled the shoe from production after activists, most notably Colin Kaepernick, complained that the flag was offensive because of its connection to an era of slavery. Riker views this cancellation as the ultimate manifestation of the intent versus impact fallacy.
The intent versus impact fallacy being the modern ideological framework that suggests the actual intent of the speaker or the creator is entirely irrelevant.
Yeah.
The only thing that matters is the emotional impact felt by the listener.
Exactly.
Riker argues that the left demands that society assume malicious intent in all historical symbols, completely discarding the objective evidence standard established over thousands of years in Roman and English common law.
A benign historical artifact, the flag that represented the 13 colonies, is aggressively reframed by subjective, manufactured, present-day outrage, and the objective history of the object is essentially overwritten and destroyed.
It's erased.
Think about the implications of that for your daily life. Think about the last time someone in a professional setting told you to just take it easy, to find some balance, or to watch your tone because your words might have had an unintended impact. Riker is essentially arguing that all of that gentle advice is a carefully laid, highly destructive trap designed to neutralize you.
It's all a trap, Dan.
So, if a listener accepts this framework, how does Riker suggest they actually fight back? When they are sitting in a boardroom or a classroom and are confronted by what Riker derisively calls NPC zombies spouting postmodern language rules, what is the weapon?
Riker suggests weaponizing classical philosophy. Specifically, he takes Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative and aggressively applies it to modern language policing.
Let's lay out Kant's categorical imperative clearly. Kant argued that you must act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. If everyone can't do it, no one should do it.
Exactly. It is the ultimate test of logical consistency. Riker points out that if the concept of microaggressions were made a universal law, if all human communication was actively, aggressively policed for subjective, unintended emotional slights, universal communication would instantly cease to exist.
Because literally any statement, no matter how benign the intent, could be arbitrarily deemed a linguistic crime by a sufficiently hysterical or malicious listener. The system collapses under its own subjectivity.
It completely fails Kant's test of universalizability. Because of this logical failure, Riker issues a strict command to his readers. Never, under any circumstances, apologize for offending subjective emotional sensibilities.
Never apologize.
Right, because an apology validates the false premise. And when these men inevitably need to engage in public debate, Riker points them toward the heavy, unyielding intellectual artillery of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica.
The foundational text of scholastic philosophy.
Riker demands his readers study the rigid structure of the Summa. Aquinas always starts by presenting the strongest possible objection to his own argument, analyzing it coldly, and then dismantling it through pure step-by-step logical deduction.
Brilliant.
Riker uses this as the flawless, purely logical model for crushing illogical, postmodern, emotionally driven arguments. You don't get angry, you dismantle the opponent's premise with cold, Thomistic logic.
Never apologize, never cede ground. Always demand objective proof. We have covered a truly massive amount of intellectual, historical, and ideological ground today.
We really have.
Let's summarize Conrad Riker's ultimate call to action. Based on this entire sweeping architecture of biological realism, Hobbesian state of nature, Roman legal pragmatism, and Kantian duty, Riker commands his readers to actively form parallel communities. He wants men to systematically construct new digital and physical agoras.
He specifically calls for the creation of invite-only martial arts gyms, unregulated full-contact football camps for youths, and literal underground fight clubs, spaces where the state cannot install a safety governor.
He demands that men violently reject the state's pharmaceutical chains, ignore mainstream dietary guidelines, divest from the fiat banking system, and embrace intense, painful physical training not as a weekend hobby, but as an absolute moral imperative required to save Western civilization from collapsing into a padded room.
And as we close the book on this incredibly dense analysis, I must gently remind you, the listener, of the framework we established at the beginning of the album.
Yes, very important.
While this deep dive has thoroughly, and I hope clearly, explored the intricate, highly controversial architecture of Conrad Riker's intensely polarizing, red-pilled worldview, the show itself remains an impartial vehicle. We are here to analyze the complex texts you bring to the table, mapping the coordinates of these radical arguments without ever endorsing the destination.
Exactly. We break down the X-ray, we don't prescribe the cast. And if those philosophical coordinates have sparked your curiosity, if you want to read the raw, unfiltered source material directly to see how Riker constructs these arguments word by word, please remember to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook Virtue in the Scrum.
Highly recommended if you want to see the primary source.
And you can follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for his ongoing cultural commentary. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our show on whatever platform you're listening so we can keep bringing you these deep dives into the texts shaping our culture.
I want to leave you with a final lingering thought experiment to ponder long after this audio ends. Conrad Riker bases his entire sweeping philosophy on the absolute unyielding necessity of the physical scrum, the real-world undeniable Newtonian friction of blood, sweat, torn muscle, and gravity. He claims virtual or sanitized spaces breed weakness. But as our society moves rapidly closer to a world of perfect virtual reality, a metaverse where advanced haptic technology and digital environments can perfectly, neurologically simulate physical resistance, exhaustion, and even intense pain, does the Scrum survive the digital transition?
Oh, wow.
If a man's brain believes he is fighting for his life, does it matter if his body's in a server room? Or does the biological imperative Riker so passionately describes demand actual, undeniable, carbon-based flesh and blood to forge the true virtues of a civilization?
If the X-ray shows a violently broken bone, but the bone is entirely digital, does it still build a stronger man when the code heals? Something to think about. Until next time.